Now, in 1917, the very same week that the United States was declaring war on Germany, many major factors were happening in the Russian Empire. As was mentioned before, the Tsar had abdicated earlier that year, and there was a Russian provisional government now in charge. And just to be clear, not everybody who lived in Russian Empire, was a Russian. There were many different ethnicities. There were the Ukrainians, there were the Tartars, there were the Finns, there were the Kazakhs. There were so many different ethnicities, all under the Russian Empire. And the Ukrainians had been wanting their autonomy for many years. They'd been conquered and reconquered time and time again by the Russians, and they had been forced to abandon their language. They've been forced to abandon their culture. Anything Ukrainian was beaten down viciously by the Russians themselves over the last previous centuries. Quite similar to how, as I already described, how the English treated the Irish. Kind of the same thing, only a few thousand miles or so east. And so in the first week of April of 1917, the Ukrainians began forming their own government. They began taking charge. They began tearing down the Russian signs and putting up Ukrainian signs. They allowed the Ukrainian language for the first time in a long, long time. And they just did everything they could to make everything Ukrainian again, restore Ukrainian pride. And what happened after that was they weren't able to fully stabilize everything. There's a great deal of information I'm leaving out. But to sum it up, they wanted to form their own nation, but they were unable to because of all the different elements, because the Soviets in the Soviet Union were doing everything they can to undermine the process. Like, for example, as soon as Stalin became a leader in the Soviet Union, not the leader itself, but he was put in charge of certain elements when the Soviets first came to power. One of the first things he did was his job was to actually gather food. Where did he look? Ukraine. So they began doing everything they could to undermine the Ukrainian government and to get Ukrainian grain. The Red Army actually invaded. They actually attacked. Ukraine was under bombardment left and right. Plus, they were still dealing with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. So Ukraine was unable to actually stabilize itself. But it actually did declare its independence in 1918, and for a short period of time, Ukraine was actually its own nation. And it was one of the first areas actually declared its independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. And it's also right now being reinvaded by Russia once again. There's a lot more too that I'm leaving out, but just so it's clear, the Ukrainians at this time in 1917 were trying very hard to reestablish their autonomy being under a fierce boot heel of the Tsar and the Russian Empire, and they were determined to regain their autonomy in any ways they could. So I invite you to study more on that. There you go.